Cora Halloran dropped her two carpet bags on the dirt. The dust, the color of rust and regret, puffed up around the worn leather bottoms and settled on the hem of her dress. Beside her, her son Sam stood as still as a fence post, his small hand lost in hers. He did not look at the sprawling, beleaguered ranch house, nor at the skeletal corrals that seemed to be holding their breath against the wind. He looked only at his mother's face, his eyes searching for the map that would tell him if this was the place they finally stopped walking. Cora offered him a small, tight smile that did not reach her own eyes. Her eyes were the gray of creek stones after a hard rain, washed clean of everything but a stubborn, weary resolve. She looked at the house, a long, low building of sun-bleached timber that sagged in the middle like an old horse. She looked at the barn, which listed slightly to the west, as if tired of fighting the prevailing wind. She looked at the man who now stood on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression a careful mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. This was the High Lonesome Ranch. It was the end of the line. She had heard the name in a dusty general store 2 towns back, a place that smelled of coffee beans and horse liniment. Two old men, their faces carved with the history of sun and hardship, had spoken of it. They spoke of Elias Thorne, a man who had inherited a good spread in a bad run of luck, a man who had been cheated by a partner years ago and had trusted no one since, a man who was trying to hold on to his father's legacy with a dwindling crew and a heart full of gravel. He was a man, they'd said, who was too proud to ask for help and too broke to hire it. Cora had listened, her hands tight around the last of her coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of her prospects. A proud, broke man might just be desperate enough. Desperation was a language she understood. It was the only currency she had left. Now facing him, she saw the truth of their words. Elias Thorne was not a large man, but he was built of the same dense, unyielding material as the high country rock that surrounded them. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, and his face was a study in grim acceptance. He looked at her, at the boy, at the two sad bags, and his eyes, a paler gray than her own, narrowed. He looked at them the way a rancher looks at a coyote lingering near the chickens, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and without sentiment. "Whatever you're selling, we're not buying," he said. His voice was rough, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. It wasn't unkind, merely devoid of expectation. Cora took a breath, the thin, dry air burning her lungs. It tasted of dust and distant pine and the profound loneliness of the landscape. She had rehearsed a dozen speeches on the long walk from the last town, speeches full of carefully chosen words meant to inspire pity or confidence. Looking at him now, she knew none of them would work. Pity was a luxury for people who had something left to give. Confidence was a lie she was too tired to tell. All she had was the truth. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I can keep books. I know cattle. My boy is quiet and won't be a bother." Elias Thorne's expression did not change. He finished wiping his hands and tucked the rag into his back pocket. "I'm not hiring. Got a full crew." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The state of the place was a testament to the hands he lacked. Fences needed mending, the porch steps groaned under his weight, and a shutter on an upstairs window hung from a single hinge, banging a mournful rhythm in the wind. "You have 3 hands for a ranch this size," Cora stated. It wasn't a question. She had watched from a ridge for an hour before approaching, counting the men as they moved about their tasks. She saw the inefficiency, the weariness in their movements. "One old, one young, and one who looks more tired than you do. You need another hand, but you can't afford one. What you can afford is a woman who will work for room and board until you see she's worth a wage." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even respect, crossed his face. He was not used to being read so plainly. "You know a lot for someone who just walked up." "I know what a struggling ranch looks like," she said, and the words carried the weight of a ghost, the ghost of her own ranch, the one she and her husband had built and then lost to fever and bankers in the same cruel winter. "I know the look of a man carrying too much on his own." He was about to send her away. The word was on his lips, the final weary dismissal. He had seen women like her before, desperate, trailing tragedy like a scent. They were another mouth to feed, another problem to manage. He had enough of his own. He opened his mouth to say no, to tell her to try the next spread, 50 miles down the valley. But before the word could form, a shout came from the barn. "Boss, Thorne! Get out here!" The voice was young, laced with panic. Elias Thorne's head snapped toward the sound. He was off the porch in 2 long strides, his weariness forgotten, replaced by the sharp-edged focus of a man who lived with the constant threat of disaster. Cora hesitated for only a second before grabbing Sam's hand and following. Trouble was an opportunity, her last one. Inside the dim, cavernous barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and fear. Finn, the young hand she had seen from the ridge, was trying to hold a struggling newborn calf against the flank of a nervous heifer. The calf, all wobbly legs and wet dark fur, bleated weakly, pushing its head uselessly against its mother's side. The heifer, a first-timer, sidestepped, her eyes wide with confusion and agitation, and lowed unhappily. Jed, the tired-looking hand, was trying to soothe her, his voice a low grumble that did nothing to calm the animal. "She won't take him," Finn said, his face strained. "Just dropped him an hour ago. She's cleaned him off, but she won't let him nurse. It's getting cold." Elias swore under his breath. A rejected calf was a death sentence if they couldn't get it to feed. It meant hours of bottle feeding with milk they couldn't spare, or a slow, inevitable fading. He moved in, his hands sure and practiced, trying to maneuver the heifer into a better position. But she was agitated, her fear making her strong and unpredictable. She kicked out, not with malice, but with panic, narrowly missing Elias's head. "Hold her steady, Jed," Elias grunted, his face grim. "I'm trying." She spooked something fierce. They were a tangle of frustration. The men were using force, trying to bend the animal's will to their own, and it was only making things worse. Cora stood in the doorway, Sam hiding behind her skirts, and watched. She saw not a stubborn animal, but a frightened new mother. She saw not a problem of will, but one of instinct. She had seen this before. Her husband, a man of gentle hands and quiet wisdom, had taught her what to do. She stepped forward. "You're scaring her," she said, her voice calm but clear, cutting through the tense grunts of the men. 3 heads turned to look at her. Elias's face was dark with annoyance. "This ain't your concern, ma'am." "It is, if you want that calf to live through the night," she replied, her gaze unwavering. She looked past him, at the heifer. "You're all going at her like she's a threat. She's just confused. Let me try." Jed scoffed. "What's a woman gonna do that we can't?" Cora ignored him. Her eyes were on Elias. It was a challenge, a wager, her survival against his pride. He stared at her for a long moment, the sounds of the struggling animals filling the space between them. He saw the certainty in her posture, the lack of fear in her eyes. He was a man drowning in problems, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if she was a rope or just another stone. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Fine, be my guest." He and the other men stepped back, their skepticism a palpable thing in the dusty air. Cora moved slowly, deliberately. She did not approach the heifer directly. Instead, she went to a small grain bin in the corner. She scooped a handful of oats and then walked to a shelf where a jar of molasses sat, used for doctoring feed. She drizzled a sticky, dark line of it over the grain in her palm. "Sam," she said softly, not looking back, "stay by the door." The boy didn't move. He just watched, his small face serious. Cora approached the calf, murmuring to it in a low, soothing tone. She let it smell her hand, then gently scooped some of the molasses onto her fingers and smeared it over the calf's wet fur along its back and rump. The sweet, earthy smell filled the air. Then she walked around to the heifer's head, moving not with the tense energy of a wrangler, but with the calm purpose of a fellow creature. She held out her palm, the molasses-laced grain offered as a treaty. The heifer's ears twitched. Her wide, dark eyes watched Cora's every move. She snorted, her breath warm. But she didn't pull back. The smell of the molasses was strong, enticing. She stretched her neck, her wet nose twitching, and tentatively licked the grain from Cora's hand. Her long, rough tongue was surprisingly gentle. As she ate, Cora continued to speak to her in that same low, crooning voice. a sound like water running over smooth stones. While the mother was distracted by the treat, Cora gently nudged the calf back toward her flank. The calf, smelling the familiar scent of its mother mixed with the sweet allure of the molasses on its own fur, began to root around again. The heifer, her attention divided between the sweet taste in her mouth and the persistent nudge at her side, shifted her weight. She was still tense, but the sharp edge of her panic had softened. The calf found what it was looking for. It latched on, its small tail giving a frantic, joyous wiggle. The heifer flinched, her muscles tightening. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed she would bolt again. But the calf was persistent, and the memory of the sweet grain was still on her tongue. A deep, shuddering sigh went through the animal. Her body relaxed. She stood still, her head drooping slightly, and let her baby nurse. Silence descended on the barn, broken only by the soft, rhythmic sounds of the nursing calf and the mother's heavy breathing. Jed's mouth was slightly agape. Finn stared, his young face a mask of awe. Elias Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had watched her hands, her voice, the quiet confidence of her movements. He had seen a skill that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with understanding. It was a kind of competence he hadn't seen in a long time. It was the competence of someone who didn't just work with animals, but listened to them. Cora straightened up slowly, backing away without a sound, giving the new family its space. She walked back to where Elias stood, her face calm, betraying none of the fierce, desperate hope that was hammering in her chest. She stopped in front of him and waited. He looked from her to the now peaceful animals, then back to her. The set of his jaw was still hard, but the suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a grudging respect. He was a practical man, and he could not deny what he had just seen. He had been ready to lose a calf. She had saved it with molasses and quiet. Clear his throat. He cleared his throat. The cook's quarters are in the back of the house. They're small. Cora's heart gave a painful lurch. They'll do. 30 days, he said, his voice all business, betraying none of the shift that had just occurred within him. Room and board for you and the boy. You cook, you clean, you make yourself useful. At the end of 30 days, we'll see. If you've earned it, there's a wage. If you haven't, you move on. That's the offer. There was no warmth in it. It was a contract laid out on stony ground. But it was a foothold. It was a chance. It was everything. We'll earn it, Cora said. She turned and walked to the doorway where her son was waiting, his eyes wide. She took his small hand in hers. For the first time that day, her smile reached her eyes. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. They had a place to sleep tonight. They had 30 days. The first day was a campaign waged with soap and water. The cook's quarters were 2 small rooms, barely more than closets, thick with the dust of disuse and smelling of mice and old sorrows. Cora set to work with a methodical fury. She sent Sam outside with a piece of charcoal and a flat stone to draw on, positioning him where she could see him from the window. Then she opened the windows to the biting wind, stripped the thin, musty mattress from the cot, and dragged it outside to beat the dust and despair out of it. She scrubbed the floors until the pale wood reappeared from beneath a layer of grime. She washed the single window until the weak afternoon light could find its way in, clean and sharp. She worked without stopping, her movements economical, her focus absolute. This small space was the first piece of ground she had claimed in a year. She would make it clean. She would make it hers. By late afternoon, she moved her campaign to the main kitchen. It was a disaster. Greasy pans were stacked by a stone sink. The surfaces were grimy, and the pantry was a chaotic jumble of sacks and tins. It was a kitchen used only for function, with no care and less pride. It reflected the spirit of the house, surviving, not living. She found a side of bacon, a sack of potatoes, some onions, and a half-empty canister of flour. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When the men came in from their work, stamping the cold and dirt from their boots, they stopped in the doorway. The air was different. For the first time in years, the ranch house didn't smell of sweat, old leather, and wood smoke. It smelled of frying bacon and onions. It smelled of hot coffee. It smelled faintly of hope. They stood there momentarily stunned, like men who had forgotten what a real kitchen smelled like. Elias was the last to enter. He stopped behind his men, his eyes taking in the scene. The long, scarred wooden table was scrubbed clean. Tin plates and cups were set out. In the center of the table sat a platter piled high with fried potatoes and bacon, and beside it, a stack of freshly made biscuits, golden brown and still steaming. It was the simplest of meals, but it was prepared with an attention to detail that felt like a revelation. The men ate in a kind of stunned silence. Jed the skeptic ate 3 biscuits without a word, his chewing the only sound he made. Finn, the young hand, kept glancing at Cora with open admiration. Silas, the old man who rarely spoke, gave a slow, deliberate nod after his first bite, a gesture that carried more weight than a flowery speech. Sam sat on a small stool by the hearth, away from the men, eating a biscuit Cora had given him, his eyes following his mother's every move. Cora did not sit with them. She served the coffee, refilled the platter, and moved about the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible. She was a presence, a force of order, but she did not impose herself. She simply did the work. Elias watched her. He had hired a cook. He had not expected this. He had not expected the quiet transformation of his chaotic kitchen into a place of warmth and order in a matter of hours. He had not expected the simple meal to feel like a feast. He ate, and for the first time in a long time, the food did not taste of ash and obligation. As he looked at the woman moving silently in the firelight, he felt a flicker of something he had long since buried, a cautious, fragile curiosity. He had offered her 30 days to prove her worth. He was beginning to suspect it wouldn't take that long. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by Cora's quiet competence. The scent of baking bread became a regular morning greeting. The men's torn shirts and worn socks began to appear, mended in neat piles on their bunks. The pantry, once a chaotic mess, was now a model of order, its shelves lined with neatly labeled jars and sacks. Cora worked from before sunrise until long after the men had retired for the night. She was not just a cook, she was a force of restoration. She was slowly, methodically, pushing back the tide of neglect that had threatened to swallow the high lonesome whole. Her work was a language, and some of the men were beginning to understand it. Finn was her first true ally. He started bringing in extra firewood for her stove without being asked. He would talk to Sam, showing him a carved wooden horse he'd whittled or pointing out a hawk circling high overhead. Sam never spoke back, but he would watch Finn, his solemn little face showing a spark of interest. Silas, the old hand, began leaving a pail of fresh milk on the kitchen step every morning, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. His approval was a rare and valuable currency on the ranch, and his quiet gestures did not go unnoticed. Jed, however, remained resistant. He saw her efficiency not as a virtue, but as a judgment on how things had been done before. He saw the order she created as a disruption to his familiar world. He grumbled about the food, even though he ate more of it than anyone. He complained that she had moved the coffee pot. He muttered that a woman's place was not to be organizing the running of a ranch kitchen as if she owned it. His resentment was a low, constant hum, the sound of a man who feared change because he suspected he would not be able to keep up with it. The confrontation came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks into Cora's probationary month. A cold snap had settled over the mountains, and the men had been out all day mending a section of fence on the North Range, their hands and faces raw from the wind. They came in half frozen, looking forward to a hot meal. Cora had made a thick beef stew, simmering it for hours until the meat was tender and the gravy was rich. The men fell upon it gratefully, their spoons clattering against the tin bowls. All except Jed. He took one bite, then pushed his bowl away with a look of theatrical disgust. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice loud in the quiet room. "This is thin as dishwater. A man can't work a full day on broth and whispers of meat." The other men stopped eating. Finn looked mortified. Silas's face was impassive, but his eyes were fixed on Jed. Elias, seated at the head of the table, slowly lowered his spoon. Cora was standing by the stove, a cast-iron skillet in her hand, which she had just finished cleaning. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger. She simply turned to face him, the heavy skillet held loosely at her side. It was not a weapon, but it was a symbol of her domain. "The stew is made from the quarter of beef you yourself brought in from the smokehouse this morning, Jed," she said, her voice even and calm. It was the last of the stringy end cut. If you want a thicker stew, you'll have to provide a better cut of meat next time. Her response was unassailable logic, a simple statement of fact, but it was also a direct challenge to his complaint, exposing it as baseless. Jed's face reddened. He was not used to being contradicted, especially not by a woman who was, in his eyes, little more than a hired charity case. "Don't you get smart with me," he snarled, pushing his chair back. "I've been on this ranch for 10 years. We did just fine before you showed up with your fancy notions and your silent brat." The insult directed at Sam was a line crossed. A stillness fell over the room. Sam, who had been sitting by the hearth, flinched as if struck. Cora's eyes, which had been calm, now hardened into chips of gray flint. The hand holding the skillet tightened, the knuckles white. But she did not move. She did not need to. "That's enough, Jed." Elias's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a razor. He had been watching the entire exchange, his face a grim mask. He rose slowly from his chair, his gaze fixed on the resentful ranch hand. "She stated a fact," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The meat was poor, the stew is good, better than any meal you've managed to complain your way through in the last 5 years." He took a step closer. "And you will not speak of the boy again. Ever. Do you understand me?" Jed stared at his boss, his anger warring with the sudden realization that he had miscalculated badly. He had expected Elias, a man who kept his distance from everyone, to side with his longtime hand. He had not expected this quiet, firm defense of the newcomer. He looked from Elias's cold eyes to Cora's unyielding stance, and saw an alliance he hadn't known existed. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. "Yeah," he mumbled into his chest. "I understand." "Good," Elias said. He turned his gaze to Cora. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. It was a look of mutual acknowledgement. He had seen her strength, her refusal to be bullied. She had seen his fairness, his unexpected defense of her and her son. In that silent exchange, something shifted. Her position on the ranch, once precarious and provisional, had just been forged into something stronger. She was no longer just the cook. She was under the protection of the owner. She had a place. Elias sat back down and picked up his spoon. "Eat your stew, Jed," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The incident was over. The men resumed their meal, the quiet in the room now one of respect rather than tension. Cora turned back to the stove, her heart beating a little faster. She placed the heavy skillet on its hook. She had won the battle, not by raising her voice or a weapon, but with the simple, undeniable truth of her competence, and she had not had to fight it alone. The incident with Jed marked a subtle but profound change in the ranch's ecosystem. Cora's authority in her domain was no longer questioned. The men, even Jed, treated her with a new level of respect. But for Cora, the more significant change was in her relationship with Elias. He began to speak to her more, not just about meals or household needs, but about the ranch itself. He would linger after the other men had left the table, nursing a cup of coffee, and ask her opinion on the price of grain or the health of a new foal. He spoke to her as an equal, a fellow mind who understood the harsh arithmetic of running a ranch. One evening, finding the ranch's financial ledgers in a dusty, disorganized pile on a desk in Elias's small office, Cora felt a familiar pull. This was a language she knew as well as she knew the feel of dough under her hands. The next day she approached him. "The books are a mess," she said directly. "I can put them in order for you, if you'll let me." Elias looked at her, his usual guard firmly in place. The ledgers were the heart of the ranch's private business, a record of its slow bleeding. Letting her see them was an act of profound trust, an invitation into his vulnerabilities. He remembered the partner who had cheated him, a man whose clever manipulations of those very books had nearly cost him everything. The scar from that betrayal was deep, but he also remembered her clear-eyed assessment of the ranch the day she arrived, the calm logic with which she had faced down Jed, the undeniable competence she brought to every task. "All right," he said after a long pause, the word costing him more than she could know. "But you tell no one what you find in there." "My business is my own," she replied, a quiet promise. For the next week, Cora spent her evenings in the small office, the flickering lamplight illuminating the cramped columns of figures. Sam would sleep on a small pallet she made for him in the corner. The work was painstaking. The previous bookkeeper had been careless, and the records were a tangle of messy handwriting and questionable math. But Cora was methodical. She created new pages, cross-referencing receipts, untangling years of neglect. She was not just organizing numbers. She was reading the story of the High Lonesome, a story of struggle, bad luck, and a slow, grinding decline. And then she found it. It wasn't a single, dramatic error. It was something far more insidious. It was a pattern. The receipts from their primary supplier in the nearby town of Redemption, a man named Henderson, were consistently high. Not outrageously so, just a little bit more for every sack of grain, a few cents extra on every pound of salt, $1 more for a barrel of nails. It was a slow, steady siphoning, almost invisible unless you were looking for it with a keen and skeptical eye. She cross-referenced the prices with an old catalog from a larger supplier in Cheyenne she found tucked away in a drawer. The discrepancy was undeniable. Over the past 5 years, the High Lonesome had been overcharged by hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. She then noticed something else. Henderson's supply was co-owned by a man named Thorne, Marcus Thorne, Elias's cousin. The same cousin who, according to ranch gossip Finn had shared, owned the neighboring spread and had been trying to buy Elias out for years. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just bad business. It was a deliberate, calculated campaign to bleed the ranch dry, to weaken it from the inside until it was ripe for the taking. She did not go to Elias immediately. She spent 2 more nights verifying everything, creating a clean, clear summary sheet that laid out the evidence in stark, undeniable columns. She listed the overcharges, the yearly totals, the connection to his cousin. She also did something more. Using the old catalog, she calculated what the supplies should have cost and drafted a proposed order from the Cheyenne supplier, demonstrating the potential savings. She was not just bringing him a problem, she was bringing him a solution. She chose her moment carefully. It was late, the rest of the house was asleep. Elias was in his office, staring at a map of his property, his face etched with worry in the lamplight. Cora entered quietly and placed the ledger and her summary sheet on the desk in front of him. "You need to see this," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes tired. He glanced down at the papers, his expression shifting from weariness to confusion, and then to a slow dawning, cold fury as he read. He traced the columns of figures with a calloused finger, his jaw tightening with every line. Cora stood silently, letting the numbers speak for themselves. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. The look in his eyes was one of profound betrayal, the reopening of an old, deep wound. "My father did business with Henderson's father," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I kept it going. Out of, I don't know, habit, loyalty." He shook his head, a bitter, self-deprecating motion. "Loyalty to a snake." He looked at the second sheet of paper, the one with her proposed solution. He saw not just the numbers, but the thought behind them, the forethought. She had anticipated his next question and answered it. She had seen the trap he was in and had already mapped a way out. This was more than the work of a cook. This was the work of a partner. "How did you find this?" he asked, his voice full of a quiet awe. "I know what it looks like when someone is trying to kill a ranch on paper," she said, the ghost of her own past in her voice. "They never use a gun if a ledger will do the job slower and quieter." Elias leaned back in his chair, the papers held loosely in his hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an employee, not as a desperate woman he had taken in, but as an equal. He saw the intelligence in her clear gray eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He had been fighting this battle alone for so long, a solitary general defending a failing siege. And now suddenly he had an ally, a lieutenant, someone who saw the whole map, not just her small corner of it. "Thank you, Cora," he said, and the simple words were imbued with a depth of gratitude he rarely expressed. In that moment, the 30-day probationary period became a meaningless technicality. She had proven her worth 10 times over. The unspoken truth was that she was no longer just working for the High Lonesome. She was helping to save it. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not afford to lose her. The ranch could not afford it. The discovery of Marcus Thorne's scheme lit a fire under Elias. The next morning, he rode for town, his face set like granite. He was not going to Redemption to confront Henderson and Marcus. That would be a fool's errand. Instead, he carried Cora's carefully prepared documents and a letter addressed to the supplier in Cheyenne. He also intended to visit the bank to see if he could leverage his new, more efficient supply chain into a small loan to get them through the winter. He left the ranch in the hands of Silas, the old steady hand. He left its heart, he was beginning to realize, in the hands of Cora. His absence created a vacuum, a subtle shift in the ranch's atmosphere. The work continued, but a sense of unease settled in. The High Lonesome was an isolated place, and its master's absence was always felt keenly. It was during this uneasy quiet on the second day of Elias's absence that Marcus Thorne made his move. He didn't come alone. He arrived in a buggy accompanied by two grim-faced men who looked more like hired muscle than ranch hands. They did not ride to the house. Instead, they rode directly to the creek, the lifeblood of the ranch, the only reliable source of water for the cattle on the main pasture. Cora, who had been hanging laundry on the line, saw them from a distance. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. This was not a social call. She watched as Marcus, a stout, florid man with an air of smug entitlement, dismounted. He unrolled a piece of paper and began directing his men. They started unloading fence posts and wire from a wagon that had followed them. They were going to fence off the creek. Finn came running from the barn, his face pale. "Cora, it's Marcus Thorne. He's fencing the creek. He says he's got a survey map that shows the property line is on this side of the water, not the other." Cora's mind raced. Cutting off their water was a death blow. The wells near the house could sustain them and a few animals, but not the whole herd. Without the creek, the ranch would be dead in a week. Marcus had clearly been waiting for Elias to be gone. It was a calculated, vicious attack. Jed and Silas joined them, their faces dark with anger. "That's our water," Jed growled, his hand clenching into a fist. "Been our water for 50 years. I say we go down there and tear that fence down as fast as he puts it up." "And land in jail for assault," Cora said sharply, her voice cutting through his bluster. "That's what he wants, Jed. He wants a fight. He wants to be able to call the sheriff and have us arrested. Then the ranch is his for the taking, with no one left to defend it." Her logic was cold and inescapable. Jed's anger deflated, replaced by a sense of helpless frustration. They were trapped. Elias was gone. The law, backed by a piece of paper, was on Marcus's side. They could watch their livelihood die, or they could fight and lose everything even faster. Panic began to creep into the men's eyes. They looked to Silas, the de facto leader, but the old man just stared grimly toward the creek, his face a mask of worry. They were out of options. But Cora's mind was not on fighting. It was on the small, dusty office. It was on the piles of old papers, the forgotten history of the ranch she had spent nights sorting through. She remembered seeing a long tin tube, sealed with wax, tucked away on a high shelf. It had been labeled Territorial Charters. At the time, she had thought it was just old, irrelevant history. But now, "Jed, I need you and Finn to start hauling water from the well," she said, her voice suddenly crisp with authority. "Fill every trough, every barrel we have. We need to buy ourselves time. Silas, I need you to keep an eye on them. Do not engage. Do not speak to them. Just watch." The men stared at her. She was giving orders. A woman, a newcomer, was taking charge. But there was a certainty in her voice, a clarity of purpose that cut through their panic. It was the same calm authority she had shown in the barn with the calf, the same unshakable confidence she had displayed in the kitchen with Jed. In the absence of Elias, she was the one with a plan. Jed hesitated for a second, then gave a curt nod. "All right, you heard her. Let's get to it." He was a man who respected strength, and right now Cora was the strongest one among them. As the men hurried to their tasks, Cora ran to the house. Sam, who had been watching the whole scene from the porch, his small face tight with fear, ran to her. She knelt down, her hands on his small shoulders. "Stay inside, sweetheart. Lock the door behind me. I will be back soon. Everything is going to be all right." He looked into her eyes and seeing not fear but a fierce resolve, he nodded and scurried inside. Cora entered the office and closed the door behind her. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and dry ink. She dragged a chair over to the high shelf and climbed up, her heart pounding. She reached for the tin tube, her fingers brushing away a thick layer of dust. The wax seal was brittle and cracked with age. She broke it open and carefully slid out the rolled-up parchment within. It was a map, but not a survey map. It was older, hand-drawn on thick, yellowed linen. The ink was faded, the script ornate. It was a territorial water rights charter granted to Elias's grandfather by the territorial governor, dated 1858, 20 years before the official surveys Marcus was relying on had even been commissioned. And there, in faded but legible script, it granted the High Lonesome Ranch perpetual and unbreakable access to the waters of the Clear Creek, from its source to the southern boundary, regardless of any subsequent surveys or claims. Cora's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the weapon they needed. Not a gun, not a fist, but a piece of history, a promise made on paper, older and more fundamental than Marcus Thorne's deceit. She carefully rolled the charter back up and slid it into its tube. She walked out of the office, her steps measured and sure. She was no longer just a cook fighting for a place to sleep. She was a woman defending her home. She walked out onto the porch just as Marcus Thorne and his men were hammering in the last fence post. The creek was now sealed off, a line of fresh-cut wood and glinting wire severing the ranch from its own lifeblood. Marcus turned, a triumphant smirk on his face, and saw her standing there. "The work is done, ma'am," he called out, his voice oozing false civility. "I'd advise you and your men to respect the new property line. The sheriff will be by later to make it official." Cora did not answer him. She simply started walking toward him, her head held high, the tin tube held firmly in her hand. The men, who had been watching from the barn, fell silent. She walked down the gentle slope, across the dry grass, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound. She did not hurry. She moved with a deliberate, unshakable calm that was more unnerving than any threat. She stopped a few feet from the new fence, her clear gray eyes meeting Marcus's smug gaze. "You've gone to a lot of trouble for nothing, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying easily on the still air. Marcus's smirk faltered. "I don't know what you mean. The law is the law." "Yes, it is," Cora agreed, "and the oldest law stands tallest." She opened the tube and carefully unrolled the charter, holding it up for him to see. "This is a territorial water rights charter from 1858. It predates your survey by 2 decades. It grants this ranch unbreakable access to this creek. I believe the sheriff will find it quite official." Marcus stared at the ancient document, his face draining of color. He squinted, trying to read the faded script from a distance. He saw the official seal, the ornate lettering. He saw the look on Cora's face, not of anger but of absolute certainty. He had been so sure of his plan, so confident in his crooked survey. He had never imagined a ghost from the past could rise up to defeat him. His men looked from the paper to their boss, their own confidence beginning to crumble. As if on cue, the sound of an approaching rider could be heard. It was the town sheriff, a portly man with a weary expression, coming to enforce Marcus's claim as requested. He rode up, dismounted, and looked at the tense tableau. "What's all this, Marcus?" he asked. "Just securing my property line, Sheriff," Marcus said, trying to recover his bluster. "This woman is trespassing and making threats." The sheriff looked at Cora, who stood calm and silent. She didn't look threatening. She looked resolute. He then looked at the document in her hand. "What's that you've got there, ma'am?" "The original water rights charter for this land, Sheriff," Cora said, holding it out to him. "I'm sure you'll want to see it before you make any decisions." The sheriff took the parchment, his eyebrows rising as he examined it. He was a man of the law, and he knew the weight of a document like this. He read the key phrases aloud, his voice slow and deliberate. "Perpetual and unbreakable access, regardless of any subsequent surveys or claims." He looked up, his gaze hard, and pinned Marcus Thorne with it. "This charter is ironclad, Marcus. Your survey is meaningless. This water belongs to the High Lonesome. Now you and your men will take this fence down. Every post, every inch of wire, or I will arrest you for illegal obstruction of a waterway and malicious deprivation of property." The defeat was total and public. Marcus Thorne stood there, his face a mottled red and white, utterly humiliated. His power, built on bullying and deceit, had been dismantled by a piece of paper in the hands of a woman he had dismissed as a nobody. Without another word, he and his men began the grim, silent work of undoing their morning's labor. Cora watched them for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the house. Finn and Jed were staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and profound respect. She had not raised her voice, had not thrown a punch, but she had won a victory more complete than any brawl could have achieved. She had saved them. She walked onto the porch where Sam was waiting, the door held open just a crack. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. She knelt and pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair. The crisis was over. She had faced the wolf at the door and turned him away. And in doing so, she had defended not just a piece of land, but a place that was, against all odds, beginning to feel like home. Elias Thorne returned 2 days later. He rode in late in the afternoon, his horse and his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The trip had been a partial success. He had secured the new supply line from Cheyenne, a move that would save the ranch a significant amount of money. But the bank in town, swayed by Marcus's influence, had refused his request for a loan. He had returned with one problem solved and another looming larger than ever. He was bracing himself to deliver the bad news, to face the continued slow decline of his family's legacy. What he found instead was peace. The men were working with a quiet, efficient energy he hadn't seen in them before. The cattle were grazing contentedly by the creek, a creek that was, inexplicably, no longer fenced off. He saw no sign of Marcus or his men. He rode to the house, a deep sense of confusion settling over him. He found Cora in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread, her movements rhythmic and soothing. Sam was at the table, carefully drawing a picture of a horse on a piece of slate. The scene was so profoundly domestic, so peaceful, that it felt like a world away from the financial battles he had just been fighting. Cora looked up as he entered, and a small smile touched her lips. "You're back," she said. "I am," he replied, his eyes searching her face. "What happened here? The fence is gone." So she told him. She told him everything, her voice calm and matter-of-fact as she described Marcus's arrival, the fencing of the creek, and the discovery of the old charter. She did not embellish her own role. She simply laid out the facts, the problem, and its solution. Elias listened, his expression unreadable, his body unnaturally still. He stood by the door, the dust of the trail still on him, and absorbed the story of how his ranch had been threatened and saved in his absence. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. He looked at her, at the flower on her hands, at the quiet strength in her eyes. He thought of his own fruitless trip, his battles with bankers and ledgers. He had been away fighting for the ranch's future, while she had been here, saving its present with intelligence and courage. He had left her in charge of his kitchen. She had taken charge of his legacy. He walked over to the wash basin and poured some water, slowly washing the dust from his face and hands. The silence was thick with unspoken things. Finally, he turned to her, drying his hands on a towel. "I went to the bank," he said, his voice quiet. "They turned me down. Marcus had already been there, poisoning the well." He paused, his gaze steady. "I came back here thinking we were one step closer to the end. Instead, I find you've won a war I didn't even know how to fight." He sat down at the table across from where she stood. He looked tired, but it was a different kind of weariness now. The grim, solitary weight he always carried seemed to have lessened, replaced by a sense of wonder. "When I gave you this job, I offered you 30 days, he said. "A probationary period. I was a fool." He looked at his own calloused hands resting on the scrubbed wood of the table. "I hired a cook. What this ranch got, what I got, was something else entirely." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw him without his armor. The skepticism, the guardedness, it was all gone. In its place was a raw, honest vulnerability. "This ranch is barely hanging on, Cora. The money I'll save with the new supplier will help, but it's not enough. It's going to be a long, hard winter. I have nothing to offer you but more work, more uncertainty." He took a breath. "But I can't do it alone anymore. I thought I could, but I can't. This place doesn't just need a good cook. It needs a good mind. It needs you. The offer hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. This was not about a wage. This was not about employment. This was about something more permanent. I'm offering you a partnership, he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid they would vanish if he didn't say them quickly. A full partnership. Your name on the deed next to mine. Half of whatever this ranch is, and half of whatever we can make it. It's not much of an offer, he added, a wry, tired smile touching his lips. Half of almost nothing is still almost nothing. Cora did not stop working the dough. Her hands continued their steady rhythm of pushing and folding, a rhythm that had grounded her through years of loss and uncertainty. She looked at him, at this tired, proud, and honest man. She looked at her son, safe and quiet by the fire. She looked around the warm, clean kitchen, a space she had filled with the scent of bread and the feeling of home. A month ago, she had arrived here with nothing but 2 carpet bags and a desperate hope. She had been looking for a job, a place to survive. She had not expected to find a place to belong. She was not the same woman who had walked up that dusty path. The desperation had been burned away, replaced by a quiet confidence in her own worth. She was not accepting his offer out of necessity. She was accepting it as a choice to stay, a choice to build. She finished kneading the dough, shaping it into a smooth, round loaf. She placed it in a greased pan to rise. Only then did she wipe her hands on her apron and sit down at the table across from him. "All right, Elias," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's save this ranch." A profound sense of relief washed over his face, so palpable it was as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He just looked at her, a look of gratitude and a dawning, fragile hope. Music. The final scene unfolded months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks. The light in the ranch house kitchen was warm and golden, a bastion against the growing cold outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, its flames dancing and casting long, gentle shadows on the walls. The room was filled with the quiet, comfortable sounds of a home settling in for the night. Elias sat at the long wooden table, the light from a kerosene lamp glinting off the needle in his hand as he expertly stitched a piece of torn bridle leather. His movements were slow and content, the focused work of a man at peace in his own house. Across from him, Sam sat on his small stool, no longer drawing on a slate, but carefully turning the pages of a picture book Elias had bought for him in town. He was still a quiet boy, but the fearful tightness around his eyes had gone, replaced by a calm curiosity. He pointed to a picture of a bear and looked up at Elias. "Bear," he whispered, the single word soft but clear in the quiet room. Elias smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes, and he nodded. "That's right, Sam. Bear." Cora stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, the rich smell of it filling the room. She watched the two of them, the man and the boy, sharing a quiet moment in the warm lamplight. She felt a sense of rightness, a deep and settled peace that she had thought was lost to her forever. The high lonesome had been a place of survival, a piece of land held together by one man's stubborn pride. What it got was not just a cook, or a bookkeeper, or even a partner. What it got was the woman who made it a home,